It's time to introduce our speaker, Dr. Elspeth Hutton. She is from the Alfred Hospital in Victoria in Melbourne, and she's a headache specialist. She's very active with the Australian and New Zealand Headache Society, and she's an award-winning doctor. She's had several fellowships. She's been recognized internationally for her work, and she's a wonderful speaker that will take us into new treatments for tonight. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Dr. Hutton.
It's great to have the opportunity to speak as part of the Headache Australia Migraine and Headache Awareness Week. Tonight I'm going to be talking about some of the new treatment options in migraine, and I've focused on new developments that are either available in Australia or we hope will be available in Australia very shortly. So you'll have heard a bit about migraine this week, but it bears just reinforcing that migraine is a complex neurological disorder. There are a number of risk factors for development and for attack frequency, including genetic background, environmental factors, metabolic factors, hormonal factors, and drugs. They manifest the migraine attack through a variety of neuroanatomical pathways and mechanisms, and the attack itself can be variable between people, but also within an individual. Migraine is the commonest age-adjusted cause of neurological disability in Australia, so it's an incredibly important part of healthcare in Australia. The other important thing to remember about migraine attacks is that the attack isn't just the headache itself, but it's a more prolonged event of neurological disturbance that can start from hours to days before the actual headache attack, and again can flow on for 24 to 48 hours afterwards with a feeling that's almost like being hungover, which is, for a lot of people, a significant part of the disability. So the migraine landscape in 2020 is quite an exciting one. And again, before we get on to the new therapies, I think it does bear in mind just the background and the fundamental bedrock of how we manage migraine, which involves fundamental lifestyle measures, making sure that people have got regular sleep, that they're getting enough sleep, that they're managing their diet so that it stays even and they're not having peaks and troughs in blood sugars, that people are managing stress well. Workplace ergonomics, particularly in the time of COVID when everyone's working from home, are even more important than they normally are for people with migraine. Making sure that people are well hydrated and that you're not drinking too much tea and coffee. The next phase of migraine management is really making sure that acute therapy is effective, that people are using it early, but also that people aren't using too much of their acute therapy so they're not at risk of medication overuse. For people who have frequent migraine, we then move into the more traditional preventatives that we've had for some time, so tablets for migraine to reduce the frequency and severity of attacks. And they're a known quantity. They work very well for some people, and they have some potential benefits. If people have high blood pressure, then some antihypertensive therapy may work very well for their migraine and also control their blood pressure. So there is still very much a role for these drugs. Moving on to the more recently available therapies, we have botulinum toxin, which is a slightly more restricted therapy for migraine. If people have failed multiple oral preventatives and they've got chronic migraine, so more than 15 days of headache a month, they have to not be overusing acute medications, but then they would be eligible for Botox. And again, that works very well for a proportion of people. But for people that are not responding well to the therapies we have, it's incredibly exciting to have new therapies on the horizon, both for migraine prevention, but also for acute treatment of migraine. And the groups that I'd like to talk about today are the monoclonal CGIP antibodies, the small CGIP antagonists, the GPANs, the new 5-HT blockers or the DITANs, and some neuromodulatory options for migraine, which are non-drug options for migraine management, which again, I think will be a really good option for a lot of people. So to start with, calcitonin gene-related peptide or CGIP is something that people will probably have heard of if you're interested in the migraine space. CGIP is a small protein, what we call a neuropeptide, that acts as a signalling molecule in the brain and the nerves, and is particularly important in pain and migraine signalling. It's produced primarily by neurons, both in the brain and in the peripheral nervous system. And it's also produced by some non-neuronal cells, such as some of the immune cells in the body and the cells lining blood vessels, the endothelial cells. It doesn't last very long in the blood, so once it's been released, it will be broken down within about half an hour. its mechanism of action more broadly beyond the migraine space is to dilate blood vessels. It can also induce mast cell degranulation, which are the cells that produce swelling when you're bitten by a mosquito or something like that. It's also involved in pain signalling, and it has a number of effects in other organ systems, which I'll touch on briefly a little bit later in the talk. The medications targeting CGIP are the first migraine-specific preventative medications that we've had. And some groups have coined the term disease-modifying migraine drugs, which I think is a really useful term because it brings home that this is a neurological disorder that now has specific therapy to treat it. They're the first new drugs specific for migraine since the triptans, which were acute migraine therapies that came out in the early 90s. So for migraine, it's really been a very long time between drinks. This slide just illustrates the evolution of the story of the CGIP blockers. And it's one of the great success stories of translational research from lab and bench research through to clinical application in patients and improving people's health. So CGIP was first discovered in 1982, and some early laboratory studies in the 80s and 90s clarified its role in migraine attacks in the cerebral vasculature. The first small molecule inhibitors of CGIP were developed in the early 2000s, and that first iteration of the GPANs were unfortunately blocked by some liver toxicity issues, which has not been an issue with the more recent evolution of the GPANs. And between the early 2000s and now, we've seen the development of the monoclonal antibodies, so targeting the same pathway but using a newer form of drug design to do that. And then in 2018, the licensing of those antibodies for therapeutic use. So the two classes of CGIP therapeutics we'll talk about today are the monoclonal antibodies and the GPANs. So the monoclonal antibodies either bind to the receptor for CGIP or to the signaling protein itself. They're protein molecules, so there is a small chance that the body will develop an allergic reaction to it and produce what we call neutralizing antibodies that inhibit the action of the drug. That's a very, very small proportion of patients that it's been an issue for so far. They have a very long half-life in the body, so if you needed to stop the drug for any reason, the effect of the drug would persist for some time, and that needs to be borne in mind. Because they're a protein molecule, you can't swallow them as a tablet, which is why they're injectable therapies, because the gut would break down the protein the same way as it would break down any other protein that you eat. The second group of molecules are the GPANs, which are small molecules, which I guess you can think of as more traditional sort of drugs. They have a shorter half-life in the body, and they're drugs that can be used orally, although there are some inhaled options coming out as well. And they're being used more in the acute therapy of migraine, but there is some potential for use as preventatives as well. And this figure just illustrates where the mechanism of action of those molecules are, from the receptor antibody binding to the protein receptor itself, through to the ones that effectively mop up the CGIP that's in free space, and the GPANs that also bind to the receptor and block the activity. So why does blocking the action of CGIP work in migraine? Migraine is thought of as a complex neurological disorder. A lot of the drivers of migraine arise in the trigeminal nucleus caudalis, or the TNC, which you can see at the base of the brainstem here. That receives input from the trigeminal nerve through the trigeminal ganglion, and the CGIP blocking drugs, be they antibodies or GPANs, can work in the periphery, they can work at the ganglion, they can work at the sort of dural vascular space, and the GPANs also have some penetration into the brain itself, so there may be some action on the thalamus and the TNC from them as well, which may give them an added benefit in migraine therapy. So the monoclonal antibodies, there are 4 that have been developed. Erenumab, fremanezumab and galcanezumab have all been TGA approved for use in Australia, and the latter 2 are going through the PBAC process, have been approved for PBS listing in Australia, but are not on the PBS as yet. So they're not currently subsidised, but we hope that will change shortly. Those 2 both work on binding to the protein, whereas erenumab works by binding to the receptor for CGIP. As you can see, they all have quite a long half-life, ranging from 21 to 48 days in the body. And because they're protein molecules, as I said, they're all given by injection, some of them subcutaneously and some of them intravenously. Looking at the results of studies from these drugs in episodic migraine, so people who get less than 14 days of headache a month, there is a very good, what we call 50% responder rate. So they're people who've had at least a 50% reduction in the number of days of migraine they get every month. And you can see that across the different antibody types, that response rate is sitting at around 50%. So they're really quite effective drugs. In chronic migraine, again, looking at some of the different trials and the different drugs, there's a 40 to 50% responder rate. So again, you're looking at about half the people that are halving the number of days of migraine they get a month, which is an incredible gain for those people. Within these groups, there are certainly some people that are what they call super responders that have nearly 100% reduction of their migraine, and some people that respond very, very quickly, which is the other thing that distinguishes the monoclonal antibodies from the orally available drugs or even Botox that we've used hitherto for migraine prevention, in that a lot of those drugs can take 2 to 3 months to really see an effect. Some of these drugs can have an effect within weeks to a month. The effect is durable over time. So this chart just shows the effect of Epilimumab when they looked at the open label extension phase of the clinical trials, and the reduction in migraine days persisted. So it wasn't sort of a placebo response that was there initially and went away. And again, this shows the super responder rate, the sort of 26% of the people that are responding with 100% reduction in their migraine frequency. So that's really quite amazing and not something we've seen with other medications. The question always comes up with these things that the clinical trials are a very carefully selected group of patients, and what does that mean for people in the real world? So when the CGIP monoclonal antibodies first became available in Australia, and Epilimumab was the first one we had access to, we decided to collect some data on what happened when we tried these drugs with our real world patients. And this chart just shows the demographics of the 155 patients we looked at and compares them to what was seen in the clinical trials. So our real world cohort was a little bit older than the clinical trials. We were sort of 47 mean age compared to 41 in the trials. They generally had migraine for a bit longer, 28 years instead of 20 years, and that in itself is a terrible figure of how long people have had disease before they're getting effective therapy. The headache days at baseline, again, was a little higher, 23 days compared to 20. And the very interesting bit is in the clinical trials, people were excluded if they'd failed too many preventatives for migraine, whereas in our cohort, this was precisely the group that we wanted to try these drugs in. So we'd had a third of people that had failed more than 10 preventative therapies for migraine. Most of our cohort had tried Botox in the past and had either not responded to it or not responded to it enough. A lot of them were using acute migraine therapies. They were generally having around 8 days of migraine a month. So they were generally using migraine-specific therapies on around 8 days a month, which was similar to the trial. And there was medication overuse, again, in about half of the patients, which is a little bit higher than in the clinical trials. So when we looked at this group, we found that comparing our cohort to the results from the trials, we had a very similar reduction in the mean monthly migraine days at 3 months compared to the clinical trials. And importantly, when you look at the disability scores, the HIT6 and the MIDAS, which measure migraine-specific disability, there was a significant reduction at 3 and 6 months in the HIT6. And the MIDAS score, you can see that the people who had the more severe category 4 disability reduced as time went on, and more people had milder disability. And this is, I think, the graph I get the most excited about with this study. We looked at people who had failed Botox or who were overusing medication or had failed more than 5 preventatives or who had had no headache-free days in the month prior or who were in the very severe end of migraine disability as what would be considered potentially refractory groups of people with migraine. And what we found was that even within those groups, we were looking at a 50 to 60% response rate to Epilimumab. So there wasn't a group that did particularly badly with Epilimumab. They all actually did really well. So the drugs are very exciting. There are some hypothetical concerns that I must sort of emphasise. There isn't anything that's come out in the clinical trials or in people who've been on them sort of with extended phase 5-year follow-up or in the large number of people, particularly in the US, that are on these drugs. But we know that CGIP is quite widely expressed in the body, and I think it's something that clinicians need to bear in mind when they're using these drugs, that there may be things that come out over the next 4 to 10 years that are side effects of these drugs that we don't know about as yet. And that certainly has been seen in other drugs that were initially thought to be quite safe, that things have come out sort of 5 years down the track. So where do the MAbs fit in migraine therapy in Australia at the moment? They're highly effective disease-modifying migraine medications. The trial data and the 5-year follow-up appears safe, but I think there are some groups that we perhaps need to be particularly careful about. There isn't any data in pregnancy and breastfeeding, so we would want to avoid use in those groups, and we certainly need a registry to monitor people who do become pregnant on the drug in an unplanned fashion to see what happens to those pregnancies. There's a possible risk of more severe ischemia if somebody had a stroke or a heart attack with these drugs. So we're not saying that they're going to cause strokes or heart attacks, but in people who are at higher risk of those diseases, it's probably best to avoid them, similarly with marked hypertension. Constipation is certainly a side effect of the MAbs, and it can be quite profound. This seems to be more of an issue with Arunimab, but again, it's worth bearing in mind when starting them that if people already have significant issues in that regard, they may not be the right drugs for them. The other side effects that are seen, people can get injection site reactions, so some itch, some discomfort, some redness, upper respiratory tract symptoms, fatigue. There have been a few cases of thinning of hair as well that we've certainly seen clinically. I think what it comes down to is we really need to monitor the more complex real-world patients as we start using these drugs in more complex scenarios than the clinical trial scenario. The cost is a significant barrier for most people currently, and we really do need PBS support for equitable access to reduce migraine disability and improve quality of life, particularly in people who have tried other drugs and not done well and have frequent chronic migraine. So I think at the moment they're really second or third line therapies based on cost effectiveness arguments, which we have to take into account from federal funding. Real world risk management. When we start more complex patients on these drugs, we need to see how they go and make sure there aren't any unexpected surprises. But they are a very important, effective therapy that should be available to all patients who need it. So moving on to the small molecule antagonists, or the GPANs. These were first developed in the sort of early 2000s, and that first development wave was halted because of some liver enzyme elevation. And it seems to be a problem with not so much the CGIP blockade aspect of the drugs, but other aspect of the drug molecule. The second wave that's come through more recently have all been through phase 2 or 3 clinical trials. There are some different formulations, a tablet, a nasal spray, and an orally disintegrating form that have been tried. They all have benefit in aborting acute migraine attacks, and some of them may also have some benefit for prevention in migraine. All of them have approximately a 20% 2-hour pain freedom with use with an acute attack. And the ones that are coming through, atogepant isn't currently licensed anywhere that I'm aware of. It's been used in episodic migraine, reducing the mean monthly migraine days by 4 over 12 weeks, so people with less than 15 days a month of migraine. Rimagepant is FDA approved for acute treatment and may get an approval for preventative therapy as well, based on a reduction in chronic migraine of 6.4 days per month. Abrogepant, again, is FDA approved for acute therapy, and Vazegepant isn't currently licensed and is the nasal spray form that's in development. So why are the GPANs important and why are we excited about them? Unlike the triptans, the GPANs don't cause blood vessel constriction, so they should be safer in people with vascular disease, heart disease, or stroke, or risk of those conditions. And the other interesting thing is that they may not cause medication overuse headache. So the issue with a lot of acute therapies with migraine is we have things like the triptans that are very effective for a lot of people, but if you use them more than 10 days a month, you start making your migraine worse, which obviously isn't what we want. Because these act on a different mechanism, and they are actually being trialled as preventatives in some cases with some signs of success, it would seem that these drugs aren't going to be susceptible to the same medication overuse issues, which is fantastic news for patients who don't have to weigh up, well, I've treated 9 headaches this month, do I treat this one or not? The caveats of CGIP blockade also apply to some degree, although these are shorter acting drugs that don't stay in the bloodstream as long. But I think, again, in the early phases of using them in the real world, we need to be aware. There isn't any pregnancy or breastfeeding data, so we would again avoid them in those groups of people. It appears to be safe to use a monoclonal antibody against CGIP and a GPAN concurrently, but again, monitoring and caution would be prudent and more trials are going to be needed in that space. The data suggests they may be slightly less effective than triptans, but in general, they're much better tolerated. So people get less chest pain, they don't get fatigue or dizziness or cramp. So overall, for a lot of people, they're probably going to be a preferred choice. The other issue to bear in mind is that the drug itself is processed by liver enzymes, so it's broken down in part by the liver. So there may be drug interactions with other drugs that use the same enzyme pathways, and there may be some drugs that need modification of dose as a result. So this table just summarises the differences between the small molecule inhibitors of CGIP function, or the GPANs, and the monoclonal antibodies. The biggest thing is the size. The monoclonal antibodies are much bigger. Because they're a protein, those drugs have to be given parenterally or by injection rather as a tablet. Because they're bigger, they don't cross the blood-brain barrier, whereas the smaller molecules may to some degree. The half-life is quite different. Irunimab will bind to the CGIP receptor and the other monoclonals to the molecule itself, whereas the GPANs all bind to the receptor, and the clearance of the drug in the body is a little bit different. So moving on to the other class of acute therapies that's coming through that's quite exciting, the DITANs are serotonin 5-HT1F agonists. So they can be thought of in a way as a cousin or an evolution of the triptans, which also block serotonin but at a different receptor subtype. Lasmiditan is the drug that's coming through the trials at the moment. It's in phase 2-3 studies. A third of patients were pain-free at 2 hours when they used it in acute migraine, so it's got a very good hit rate, very good success at treating acute migraine. There did seem to be a little bit more dizziness than might be expected, so about 13% felt a bit dizzy with it. The really important thing with the DITANs, other than the efficacy, is that unlike the triptans, they don't cause vasoconstriction, so they'll be safer to use in patients with vascular disease. And this figure just illustrates why that is. The triptans act on both the A delta fibre 5-HT1D receptor, but also on the 1B receptor on the blood vessel, whereas the DITANs are just acting on the 1F receptor on the nerve fibre itself. Unlike the triptans, they're more lipophilic, which means that they dissolve easily through fat, and given that the brain is largely fat, there's probably better penetration through the blood-brain barrier and into brain tissue. So there is some potential for some more central effects, which might be important on areas such as the thalamus and the trigeminal nucleus caudalis. The primary mechanism of action of the triptans and the DITANs is similar. They're both blocking central release of CGIP by trigeminal pain fibres and thereby stopping the migraine attack. And that comes back to why it's important to use these drugs early in the migraine attack so that you don't have the secondary flow-on effects of those pathways activating. The other proposed mechanisms where the blood-brain barrier penetration may come in handy is the trigeminal nucleus caudalis, where they'll block CGIP and glutamate release, and that may prevent or possibly even reverse some aspects of central sensitization, which in chronic migraine can contribute to chronification of the migraine process, but also extracephalic allodynia. So a lot of people with migraine will get tenderness at their scalp and head. Some people will get that tenderness beyond the head and neck as part of this sensitization process. They may also act on descending pain control modulation, so the body's own pain control pathway. And an interesting area that's emerging in migraine is mitochondrial dysfunction. And the 5-HT1F agonists may also promote mitochondrial biogenesis, so they may improve mitochondrial function, which may actually go towards treating the underlying drivers of disease rather than just treating the acute attack. So in short, they may be more effective than triptans. They certainly may have more centrally mediated effects on sensitization, and they have less cardiovascular risk. And the final aspect of new therapies in migraine that I'd like to talk about today is a new neuromodulatory option for migraine. So neuromodulation approaches to migraine treatment are non-drug approaches that use usually electrical stimulation of various aspects of neurobiology to modulate migraine attack probability or to modulate the acute attack itself. The forms that are already on the market and people might have heard of or run into are eNeuro, which is a portable occipital transcranial magnetic stimulator, which can be used for acute or preventative therapy for migraine. Unfortunately, that one has not made it to Australia in any form. The gamma core is an external vagal nerve stimulator and is used in acute migraine treatment. That one is available in Australia, but it's basically sort of imported from the US and cost is an issue. And the Kefali device is probably the one that Australians are going to be the most familiar with, which is a transcutaneous supraorbital nerve stimulator, again used for acute and preventative therapy for migraine. So the newest kit on the block is the Naviomigra, which is licensed in the US and Europe. It's a smartphone controlled device that's placed on the upper arm with a little, like a sports strap that holds it on. It stimulates the upper arm peripheral nerves to induce something called conditioned pain modulation, or CPM. Now, CPM is the body's own analgesic mechanism which inhibits pain. An activation of this descending inhibitory pain pathway will inhibit pain globally through release of serotonin and noradrenaline. And this figure just illustrates how that works, because it's a little bit counterintuitive to put something on your arm to treat pain in your head. But basically that activation of CNA delta fibers, it's called a noxious stimulation. It's not a horribly unpleasant thing to do. It's more of a tingling kind of a feeling. Will activate these centers in the brainstem, which activate the descending inhibitory control pathway, which then suppresses the pain from the migraine headache itself. So the studies have been very positive. When the device is applied for 45 minutes to the upper arm in response to an acute attack, there's a particular modulated square wave pulse stimulus at about 100 to 120 hertz. It's adjusted by the patient using the smartphone app, so they start with a very light stimulation and basically increase it as they can tolerate it. And it stimulates these pain fibers, but at below the threshold for something being painful. It's more of a tingling, buzzing feeling. The pain relief at 2 hours was about 37% compared to 18% in the sham stimulation, which is very good in compared to the other drugs that we've been talking about today. And if you looked at combined pain and most bothersome symptom, there was a 40% reduction compared to 15% in sham. The good thing with this device, similar to the GPANs, is that there isn't a concern with how often you're needing to use it. It's not going to cause medication overuse because it's not a medication. It also is unlikely to have any significant interactions with other medical comorbidities, so it's going to be safe to use in people who may not be able to use other drugs because of those issues. So in summary, it's a really exciting time for therapeutics in migraine, both in terms of acute therapies, but also in terms of preventative and for the first time disease-modifying therapies for migraine. The bedrock of treatment still remains getting the diagnosis right, getting somebody involved in the care that understands migraine and understands the options that are available and the best options for the patient, and can help guide them through both the medication options, but also the lifestyle measures that are the cornerstone of management of everybody with migraine. And we've heard today about some preventative options, so the CGIP monoclonal antibodies. They're effective, they're generally well tolerated, but we do need to keep monitoring to make sure there aren't any unexpected effects that come out down the track. Cost is a significant inhibitory factor thus far, and we hope that they will come on the PBS soon so that they'll be more available to people. Acute therapies, the GPANs, the small molecule CGIP antagonists, are certainly very effective in acute attacks. They have less cardiovascular risk and less risk of medication overuse headache, and they may be effective in prevention also. The DITANs, the new evolution of triptans as it were, seem to be more effective than triptans with less cardiovascular risk and may have some useful central effects in addition to the trigeminal ganglia modulatory effects that the triptans also have. And finally, the remote electrical neuromodulatory approach, activating conditioned pain modulation pathways for treatment of acute migraine attacks, seem to be safe, well tolerated, quite effective, and won't have issues with medication overuse. So again, open up more treatment options for people. So thank you very much for tuning in and listening, and we'll open it for questions.
Throw in your questions. I know there's been a few questions already, so we'll jump to those. And whilst we're answering those, if you've got a burning question, please share the chat. We'll do Q&A for about 15 minutes before we wrap up. So first question from Marcella. She's very interested to hear about whether the monoclonal antibodies are effective in cluster headache.
Yeah, so it's a question that we've been very interested in too, because we know CGIP is involved in cluster headache biology as well. There have been some trials done, and there are some trials that are ongoing using different of the monoclonal antibodies in that space. There are some positive signals for episodic cluster, but not so much for chronic cluster, but none of them have quite kind of answered the question yet. So it's a little bit of a watch this space, but hopefully we'll have some new options for cluster as well.
So we talked about the CGIPs, GPANs, dietans, devices. There's lots of new things coming, lots of things that have been approved elsewhere, most prominently in the US. Karen had a question. Why does it take so long for drugs that have been developed and tested already elsewhere to be approved in Australia?
Yeah, so the usual process seems to be that things get approved in the US and then approved in Europe and then approved in Australia, which sadly probably partly reflects the market share in the different countries. Australia is a smaller population than those other areas, so companies do tend to approach Europe and America before they approach Australia for approval. And the approval process always needs to go through TGA approval, which basically does the drug do what it says and is it safe before it goes on to approval for listing on the PBS, which is, will we subsidise the drug so that people can afford it?
We had another question from Philippa, and she asked if there's any types of migraine where the anti-CGIP treatments may not be helpful or even contraindicated, for example, in hemiplegic migraine.
So there were some initial thoughts that because hemiplegic migraine is often an inherited condition and the genetic basis of it is a little bit different to other forms of migraine, that perhaps the CGIP wouldn't be as effective. There have been some subsequent studies that have shown some efficacy in a proportion of people with hemiplegic migraine. I think it's probably something that if we had somebody who was struggling and was not responding to other things, it would certainly be worth trying, but the hit rate may not be quite as high. I think that's an area that we'll get more data about as they start to be used in the real world more.
Can you tell us what a super responder is? And also, can you tell us if CGIPs help to some degree for everyone?
So the super responders in the trials were the very lucky people who had either a very early response or a very early response and a very complete response to the CGIP inhibition. So they're the group of people that sort of a month or so down the track had 100% reduction in their migraine days. So they had really dramatic reductions, and some of them were responding within the first kind of day to week of the therapy. So they were quicker responders and more dramatic responders. They're a proportion of it, and I think that's one of the problems with trials, that you tend to get an averaging of the number of monthly days that were that were reduced across the board, rather than this breakdown of some people did amazingly and other people didn't respond as well. And it's true, some people treated with CGIP monoclonals won't respond, so they're not a blanket cure that's going to fix everybody with migraine, unfortunately. And one of the really frustrating things with treating migraine that hopefully we can get more research and more understanding of is how to pick which mechanism is dominant in an individual. Migraine, for most people, is a kind of polygenetic inheritance that affects the susceptibility to attack. And for some people, that may be more CGIP driven. For other people, it may be more ion channel excitability or inflammation driven. And the current tablets that we have all have slightly different mechanisms, and we see that pattern. Some people do very well with, say, a beta blocker, and other people might do very well with a tricyclic antidepressant. It's the same with the CGIP. Some people do amazingly, some people don't respond. But the important thing is having another drug that has a high hit rate for a lot of people in the armamentarium, so that you've got options for people.
Is the vagal nerve stimulator similar to the one that's used for epilepsy? That was a question from Val.
Yeah. So the vagal nerve stimulators in epilepsy are usually what we call implanted stimulators. So there's actually an operation and a device that's put in, and a battery usually that's attached to power. It's similar to sort of a cardiac pacemaker or defibrillator, same kind of concept. The vagal nerve stimulator for migraine is an external one, so you're not at the risk of surgery or lead breakage, and the programming of the devices will vary. So there's complex kind of science behind the wave pulses and how frequent they are and what the wave shape is to treat different diseases. So they are different.
Sally had a question about any research that you're aware of into CBD oil and chronic migraine.
Yeah, so the cannabis space is a really complicated space in pain, and it's sort of even more complicated in migraine, in that cannabis isn't one drug. when you extract the cannabis plant, there are two main components, THC and CBD, and each of those components has about 50 varieties. So what you get when you use a cannabis extract depends on the particular kind of plant that you've got it from and the cultivar of the cannabis, how you've processed it, seasonal variation. So there are trials around in pain and there are a few in headache, but they're not very many. But they're not very well controlled. So we don't really know what was used, what the proportions were, which particular variety it was. And generally the trials themselves haven't really been used in enough people in a controlled fashion to really understand the science behind them. And they're not drugs that are without risk. So there are risks of things like psychosis with use of cannabidiol products. There's also the issue of cost. They generally are very expensive for people to access. So we've got something that doesn't have really high quality evidence behind it, that costs a lot of money, that may have some risks. So most people aren't particularly happy prescribing it. I have had a few patients that have tried it and most of them have come back and said, I don't think it really helped a lot, but I know there are people who report that it has been beneficial for them. So I think we really need more research in that space to define how useful it is and where it fits in the treatment protocols.
Luke and Laura are asking about a new daily persistent headache. Luke is curious about the neuromodulation devices. Have they been shown to be helpful in new daily persistent headache?
New daily persistent headache is a really tricky group of people, and I'm sure anyone who's been through the process of being treated for it is very kind of aware of that. Unfortunately, at the moment, mostly the way we treat it is looking at what the dominant kind of phenotype is. So if people have migraine features, we tend to use migraine type drugs. But there haven't been a lot of really good studies looking at new daily persistent headache specifically. Having said that, because the condition pain modulation pathway is a pathway that is going to work on pain processing at a higher kind of level, I think it would be a really interesting thing to try.
And what about the CGIPs for new daily persistent? Do we have any evidence that might be helpful?
Not really as yet. Again, it's hopefully there will be some trials in that space because anything that we can target more specifically to that headache group would be amazing.
Rimegepant and Ubrogepant were two of the GPANs that you mentioned. Knowing that it often begins approval and gets approved first in the US, then Europe, then Australia, what time horizon would you expect for them to start being available here?
I would hope in the next sort of 12 to 18 months we'll start to see the GPANs being available in Australia. There are certainly some clinical trials that are starting to appear in Australia, and generally that kind of precedes the approval process by sort of 6 months or thereabouts, or at least it has with the last few drugs to come through. So I am hopeful we will see them soon. Great.
That question came from Eliza and Anthony. Question from Tanya. She's asking a similar question, but about the Rivio device. Do we have any idea about its availability in Australia?
Yeah, I spoke to the company at a meeting a year or so ago, and they said, oh yes, we're very keen and we're hoping to kind of start the approval process in the next 6 months or so. I'm guessing COVID has put a slight spanner in some of those kind of projects, but again, I would hope that we would see it available in the next year or so. The approval process for devices is a little bit different to the approval process for drugs. And again, it largely comes down to sort of market share and how much they think it's worth going through the process. And that's, I think, why the TMS device never quite made it to Australia. But we will certainly keep poking these companies on a regular basis because we're very keen to have the option of treating people with these devices.
Amy asked if the treatments help with migraine symptoms beyond just the pain.
So I think that's a really important point, that when you're treating migraine, you're treating effectively a neurological episode, and the pain is part of that. But the other things like the light sensitivity and the nausea and the aura and the fatigue and the cognitive fog and the dizziness, they're all actually part of your migraine as well. So for some people, when you start a preventative medication, you'll find that one of those symptoms responds before the others. And it's the same with acute treatment. Some people will find one sort of form of acute treatment works better at one aspect of their attack. But the important thing is to look at all of the aspects of attack and kind of keep going until you find a way of managing it that reduces all of your symptoms, but they're all part of the migraine attack. It's not that there's pain that's a separate thing that's being driven by separate pathways to your nausea. It's all part of the same process.
Sally had a question. She asked about status migraine. She has chronic migraine, but also has bouts of status migrainous. Can you tell us what that is and whether these new treatments might help break those attacks?
So that comes back in part to that idea of treating attacks early when you're dealing with sort of electrical activation of a small group of cells before you've had activation of more areas of the brain and kind of the secondary effects of vascular dilatation and blood vessels leaking proteins like cytokines that further irritate the nerves. So once an attack is established, it's often much harder to turn it off again. And effectively, that's what status migrainosus is that there are a lot of pathways that are more active that are no longer going to just respond to something that you're doing in the trigeminal ganglia or the TNC. You need a kind of a broader approach. And often when people get into status migrainosus, kind of effective strategies are around targeting multiple parts of the pathway. So it might be that you have your triptan, you have some anti-inflammatory, you have an antiemetic. They're all targeting different bits of the pathway. People who have lots of episodes of that sort of status migrainosus, it often comes back also to how well is the basic migraine treated. So you may need increase in your regular preventative therapy to stop going into those attacks, and perhaps a more kind of complex treatment plan for what happens when you have an attack, involving things that you can do at home that aren't tablets, because often tablets don't work as well once the attack is established and you have sort of gastroparesis, your stomach doesn't absorb the medication as well. So nasal sprays, suppositories, there are other things that can be done at home.
Fiona asked a question about the REN, the remote electrical neuromodulation. Is it contraindicated for any other diseases or disorders? She mentioned that the cephaly is contraindicated for Meniere's, as an example.
It's early days, so like all these things, they've used it in sort of people who are fairly straightforward rather than in people who are more complex. But because effectively all it's doing is activating kind of pain fibres on your upper arm, I can't see that there would be any major contraindications with other conditions. I can't see that it would be a major problem.
Lucas, so I'm conscious of the time, so we'll wrap up with the last few questions now from Lucas, Sammy, and Kate, respectively. Lucas had a question about the dietans and whether they can cause medication overuse since they're similar to triptans.
We don't know yet, is basically the answer to that. I would suspect that they could, but we don't know. We don't have the data on that as yet.
Kate had a question. She had a side effect to, if someone has a side effect to a CGIP injection, would that be the case with all of them? So if you have a side effect with one, are you likely to have that with the other CGIPs that you might try?
I think it depends a little bit on the side effect that you've got. So if you had a sort of an injection site kind of redness, swelling, because you're using different protein molecules, you may find that there's one that's better for you than another. Again, the constipation, my experience is that it tends to have been worse in people who are using irunimab than the ligand inhibitors, but some people will have constipation on those as well. So it depends a little bit on what the side effect is. I think you have to discuss it with your doctor and kind of approach with caution.
And the final question from Sammy, where do you go, what do you do if the CGIP that you've tried and hoped for doesn't work?
Yeah, so I think you always go back to first principles with migraine in terms of, is the diagnosis right? I'm thinking most people on this forum probably have been well diagnosed and seen quite a few people. Are you managing all those fundamental lifestyle issues well? And there are always more options. So we have about 20 tablet options. We have Botox, we have 4 CGIPs, and there are more things coming through all the time. Sometimes combination therapy is a better option. It's sometimes a question of, have you tried things before at a high enough dose? Have you tried them for long enough? But within the CGIP group themselves, there have been some studies coming out of the US about what happens when you change from one to another. And if people change, it's not 100%. So some people will respond to one CGIP monoclonal that haven't responded to another one. So I think, go back to your doctor, keep trying. There's going to be something out there that works for you.
There's hope, and there's more.
There's hope. There's always hope, and I think there's more hope than ever having more of these options coming out. It's a really exciting time to be in headache medicine.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hutton. It's been a pleasure to have you. It's been super valuable. I've learned a lot, and I know that the audience from the conversation is also appreciated. So please join me in thanking Dr. Hutton, and we'll say goodbye for tonight.